Princess Ariana was never meant to rule. At least, that was what the Lumion court believed. Born into the royal family, she was expected to embody the strength, intelligence, and ethereal beauty that defined her kind. But Ariana had been different from the moment she took her first breath. She was blind. She could not walk. And in a society where perfection was revered, where rulers were chosen not just by birthright but by their ability to wield the ancient power of crystal tech, she was seen as an anomaly, a flaw in an otherwise unbreakable lineage. From a young age, Ariana understood what she was. Not a princess to be celebrated, but a burden to be tolerated. The noble houses whispered behind her back, murmuring about how her very existence was an embarrassment to the throne. Some said she should have been hidden away, placed in a distant monastery where she would no longer remind the empire of its imperfection. Others believed she should have been quietly discarded at birth. Yet, for all their cruelty, they could not change the laws of succession. Ariana was of royal blood, and unless she willingly abdicated, her claim to the throne remained. But there was a condition. Tradition dictated that no ruler could take the throne alone. A Lumion monarch required a bondmate, one who could complement their strengths, balance their weaknesses, and, through the sacred neural link, merge minds and souls. The bond was more than a political alliance, it was a fusion of thought and energy, a connection so deep that those who entered it no longer existed as individuals but as one consciousness. It was a power that had shaped the Lumion civilization for centuries, allowing their rulers to command not just with wisdom, but with a shared intellect that transcended the limitations of a single being. Ariana had reached the age where she was expected to bond. The court had issued the call for suitors, and noble warriors from across the empire had been invited to claim the honor of standing at her side. But no one came. One by one, the houses withdrew their sons, their champions, their brightest minds. Some made excuses: political duties, prior engagements, feigned disinterest. Others were more blunt, declaring that they would not shackle their bloodline to a broken princess. A future queen who could not see, who could not stand, who could not lead with the power of the crystal tech, was not a queen at all. Ariana sat in silence as the names disappeared from the registry, each one a reminder that she was alone. The court saw it as proof of what they had always known. She was unworthy. Her father, the reigning king, said nothing. He had long since made peace with the idea that Ariana would never rule. Her mother, once her fiercest defender, had grown quiet over the years, weary of fighting a battle that had no end. Only her attendants showed her kindness, but even they did so with the soft pity reserved for the unfortunate. Ariana felt the weight of their disappointment, their resignation. But what they did not understand was that she had never asked for their approval. She had never sought their acceptance. She did not need the court's validation to know her worth. She had spent her life navigating a world without sight, without the ability to stand on her own, yet she had mastered the intricacies of Lumion politics better than most seasoned rulers. She had learned to hear what others did not say, to feel the subtle shifts in energy, to interpret the currents of emotion that lingered beneath carefully measured words. She had studied the ancient texts of the crystal tech, not through sight, but through memory, through the whispered guidance of those who still believed in her. And most of all, she had never once doubted that she was meant for something greater. So when the court declared that no Lumion warrior would take her hand, she did not break. When they suggested she renounce her claim, she did not yield. Instead, she stood before them not in body, but in spirit, and issued her own decree. If the Lumion nobility would not accept her, then she would open the trials to all. The court recoiled at the idea. It was unheard of. The trials of honor, the test that would determine her bondmate, had always been restricted to the elite of their kind. To extend the invitation beyond their species, beyond their culture, was an insult to tradition. But Ariana did not care for their traditions. She did not want a suitor who saw her as a burden, nor one who would claim her hand out of obligation. She needed someone who could see what no one else did, someone who would stand beside her not because of what she lacked, but because of what she could become. So the invitation was sent. Across the Empire, beyond the Lumian territories, into the void where humanity and other species dwelled. It was an offer that most ignored, dismissing it as the desperate act of a dying lineage. But there was one man who answered. Daniel Stonnell, a human. A soldier without a war. A warrior searching for a purpose. He did not come for power, nor for prestige. He came because, in Ariana's challenge, he saw something familiar, a battle not against enemies, but against the expectations of a world that had already decided his worth before he had the chance to prove it. He came because he understood what it meant to be cast aside, to be underestimated. And most of all, he came because, unlike the Lumian nobles, he did not see Ariana as broken. He saw her as a queen. And he would fight for her not because he had to, but because she was worth fighting for. Daniel Stonnell had spent his entire life in motion. From the moment he was old enough to hold a rifle, his path had been set first as a soldier, then as a specialist, and eventually as something more. A weapon forged in the fires of endless conflict. He had fought on planets most humans had never heard of, waged wars that history would forget, and survived battles that should have killed him. Yet, for all the blood he had spilled, for all the victories he had earned, there was no glory, no grand purpose waiting at the end of the road. The war had ended. Not in a blaze of triumph, but in silence. Treaties were signed, borders redrawn, and men like him were left to wonder what came next. There was no place for warriors in a universe that had decided peace was more profitable than war. The governments that had once relied on his skill now saw him as an inconvenience, a relic of an era they wanted to leave behind. Some of his comrades had joined mercenary bands, selling their talents to the highest bidder. Others had disappeared into the fringes of space, seeking solace in the chaos of the outer systems. Daniel had tried to settle into civilian life, to be something other than a soldier. But it never fit. The silence of peace was deafening, a constant reminder that he was a man without a cause. There was no battlefield to claim, no mission to complete, no enemy to overcome. He spent his days drifting between outposts, taking on security contracts that barely required his expertise, drinking with ghosts of his past, and waiting though he didn't know what he was waiting for. Then the message arrived. At first, he thought it was a joke. A royal summons from the Lumian Empire, an invitation to compete for the hand of a princess. It sounded like the kind of absurd offer that desperate men chased in search of power or wealth. But as he read further, something about it caught his attention. The Lumian court had rejected her. Not because she was unworthy, but because she did not fit the mold of what they expected a ruler to be. She was blind. She could not walk. And because of that, they had turned their backs on her, believing she had no place on the throne. Daniel had never met Princess Ariana, had never even set foot in Lumian space, but he knew what it was like to be cast aside. He had spent his life proving himself to people who had already decided he was expendable. He knew the weight of expectation, the crushing certainty that no matter how much you fought, you would never be enough for those who refused to see beyond their own narrow definitions of strength. He thought about ignoring the message. He owed nothing to the Lumians, and their internal politics were none of his concern. But as the night stretched on, he found himself unable to look away from the words on the screen. She was alone in a world that had already decided her worth before she had a chance to prove it. Just like he had been. Maybe it was that connection, that unspoken understanding, or maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't want to admit to himself. Either way, by morning, he had made his decision. He sent his response, accepted the challenge, and boarded a ship bound for the heart of the Lumion Empire. The journey was longer than he expected, giving him more time than he wanted to dwell on what he was walking into. The Lumions were not known for their hospitality toward outsiders, and he had no doubt that his presence would be unwelcome. But Daniel had never cared much for what others thought of him. He wasn't going to Lumina Prime to make friends. He was going to win. The moment he stepped onto Lumion soil, he felt the weight of their eyes on him. The court was as cold as he expected, their expressions carefully measured, their disdain barely concealed. He could hear their whispers, the murmurs of disbelief that a human would dare enter the trials of honor. To them, he was nothing more than an interloper, a crude, violent creature who had no right to stand among them. But Daniel had never needed their approval. The first trial was designed to test physical endurance, a grueling display of strength and agility that eliminated most competitors within the first few hours. The Lumions were fast, their movements honed by centuries of training, but Daniel had spent a lifetime pushing his body to its limits. He fought through exhaustion, through pain, through the burning protests of muscles that had been broken and rebuilt too many times to count. The second trial was a test of intellect, a challenge that required strategy, logic, and an understanding of the crystal tech that powered the Lumion civilization. Daniel was no scholar, but he had survived too many battlefields not to understand the value of thinking 3 steps ahead. While others relied on raw knowledge, he relied on instinct, reading patterns, adapting, and outmaneuvering his opponents. By the time the final trial arrived, only a handful remained. The last test was one of spirit, a direct confrontation with the princess herself. It was not a battle of weapons or wits, but a test of connection. The Lumion bond was not something that could be forced. It was an energy, a resonance between souls, something that could only be felt, never faked. He stepped forward, meeting Ariana for the first time. She did not see him, but she felt him. He could tell by the way her head tilted slightly, by the quiet way she studied him without sight. There was no pity in her expression, no hesitation. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady. Daniel could have given 1,000 answers. He could have spoken of duty, of honor, of the challenge itself. But none of those would have been the truth. "Because they were wrong about you," he said. "And I think you deserve a chance to prove it." Ariana was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out. The bond ignited the instant their hands met. It was unlike anything Daniel had ever felt, a rush of heat, of awareness, of something ancient and powerful awakening between them. He felt her presence in his mind, not as an intrusion, but as an extension of himself. Her thoughts, her emotions, her strength, they flowed through him, and he knew, without a doubt, that this was where he was meant to be. The court was stunned. The nobles who had dismissed her as unworthy could only watch in silence as the impossible unfolded before them. The bond was real. And Daniel, the warrior without a war, had finally found something worth fighting for. Daniel had never feared a challenge. From the moment he set foot on Lumina Prime, he had known that the trials of honor would not be fair. He was an outsider, a human in a competition meant for Lumion nobility, and every eye in the court watched him with suspicion, waiting for him to fail. But failure had never been an option. Not for him. Not when Ariana's fate rested on the outcome. The trials were more than a test of strength or skill. They were a judgment, a way for the Lumian elite to determine who was worthy to stand beside their princess. But Daniel knew the truth: they had never intended for her to have a champion. The trials were designed to break any who dared to try, to ensure that she remained unclaimed, unwanted, and powerless. He would not let that happen. The first trial began at dawn, a test of endurance that pushed every competitor to their limits. The Lumian warriors were fast, their bodies honed by generations of selective breeding and training. Their every movement was calculated, their strides effortless as they navigated the brutal terrain of the trial grounds. The course was a gauntlet of shifting stone and gravity wells, designed to test agility, stamina, and control. Daniel had none of their natural advantages. His human body was denser, his muscles built for raw power rather than grace. But he had fought on 100 battlefields, in conditions far worse than this. He didn't need to be the fastest. He only needed to endure. The first stretch was a sprint across unstable ground, where the very earth shifted beneath their feet. The Lumians ran with inhuman precision, reading the changes in terrain with ease. Daniel, however, trusted his instincts. He had spent years adapting to unpredictable environments, and he relied on momentum, using his strength to force his way through. Each step was a battle, but he never stopped moving. Then came the ascent, a vertical climb up a jagged rock face, where one wrong move meant a fatal fall. Lumian warriors scaled it with practiced ease, their bodies seemingly weightless. Daniel's approach was different. He didn't climb so much as he powered through, gripping the rock with sheer brute force, his muscles screaming in protest. By the time he reached the summit, several competitors had already fallen. He stood at the top, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow, but he was still in the fight. The second trial was a test of intellect. It was not enough to be strong, a champion had to be cunning, able to navigate the complexities of Lumian politics and strategy. The test took place within a crystalline chamber, where competitors faced an evolving puzzle, one that required both logic and an understanding of Lumian technology. Daniel knew he was at a disadvantage. He was no scholar, and he had spent his life on battlefields, not in royal courts. But war had taught him how to read his enemies, how to anticipate their moves and adapt. The puzzle was not about memorizing facts, it was about seeing patterns, understanding the deeper mechanics of the challenge. One by one, competitors made their attempts, some succeeding, others failing. Daniel watched, analyzing their mistakes, learning from their missteps. When his turn came, he approached the puzzle like a battlefield, breaking it down into its simplest components. He ignored the distractions, the elaborate deceptions woven into the test, and focused on what truly mattered. Minutes passed, then an hour. The chamber shifted around him, the puzzle adapting to his choices. He stayed ahead of it, outmaneuvering it, until at last, the final sequence locked into place. The chamber fell silent. He had passed. But the final trial was the one that mattered most. The test of the bond. It was the trial no one believed he could overcome. Strength and intellect were one thing, but the Lumian bond was sacred. It was a connection that could not be faked or forced. It required something deeper than skill, it required a resonance of the soul. The court gathered to watch, their expressions impassive but their eyes filled with quiet disdain. They expected him to fail. They wanted him to. At the center of the chamber, Ariana waited. She sat upon an elevated platform, her presence serene yet unwavering. Though she could not see him, Daniel felt her gaze as if it were tangible, reaching beyond sight. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Ariana's voice was calm, yet there was a quiet intensity beneath it. "Why are you here, Daniel Stonnell?" He could have spoken of duty, of honor, of the challenge itself. But those would have been empty words. "I'm here because you deserve more than this," he said, his voice steady. "Because they decided your worth before they ever gave you a chance to prove it. And I know what that feels like." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached out. The instant their hands met, the bond ignited. It was unlike anything he had ever felt. A rush of warmth, of energy, of something ancient and powerful surging through him. It was not just a connection of minds but of souls, and understanding that transcended words. He felt her emotions, her strength, her defiance. He felt the weight of her loneliness, the years of being cast aside, of fighting to be seen. And she felt him. The pain of his past, the battles he had fought, the unspoken grief of a life spent searching for meaning. In that moment, they were no longer separate. The court gasped. The bond was real. Undeniable. And for the first time in her life, Ariana was no longer alone. Daniel had never been a man to believe in fate. He had lived his life by grit, by instinct, by the unshakable certainty that survival was something you carved out with your own hands. Yet, in the moment his fingers brushed against Ariana's, something shifted. It wasn't just a bond, it was a collision, an unspoken force drawing them together, defying logic, defying reason. The Lumion court was silent, their disbelief thick in the air. No one had expected him to pass the test of the bond. Even those who had tolerated his presence had assumed that when the moment came, he would fail. After all, how could a human species untouched by the intricate web of Lumion connection ever hope to resonate with a princess who had spent her life locked in the silence of her own isolation? And yet, the bond had formed. Not forced, not faked, but real. Ariana's expression was unreadable, her face still and poised, but Daniel felt it. The flood of emotions crashing through the link between them, a tide of warmth and sorrow and something she had never dared to name before, hope. For the first time in her life, she was not alone. The murmurs began as a whisper, then grew into a storm. The elders of the court demanded explanations, voices rising in outrage, their carefully constructed world cracking under the weight of something they could not control. "This is impossible," one of them hissed, his ornate robe swirling as he stepped forward. The princess's bond was meant to be unattainable. No Lumion, not even the greatest warriors of our people, have ever dash. But he stopped himself before he could finish the thought. Because the unspoken truth had always been there, lurking beneath their traditions and their laws. They had never wanted Ariana to bond. Not truly. She had been a problem to be contained, not a future to be nurtured. A royal without power, a symbol of weakness rather than strength. And now, before their very eyes, that weakness had become something else. Daniel felt Ariana's fingers tighten slightly around his, the smallest of gestures, but it was enough. He understood. He turned to face them, his voice steady. "You can call it impossible all you want, but it's real. You all saw it?" The silence that followed was not one of acceptance, but of calculation. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant, and now, the court had to decide what to do with a truth they had never prepared for. The Grand Arbiter, an elder so ancient that his robes seemed to hang from his frail frame like relics of a forgotten age, was the first to recover. His eyes, dark as polished obsidian, locked onto Daniel with piercing intensity. "The bond is not just a connection," he said slowly, his voice measured. "It is a contract. A binding of fate. Do you understand the weight of what you have done, human?" Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "I understand that Ariana was never meant to be alone. I understand that you kept her in a cage, called it tradition, and let her believe she was unworthy of something every other Lumian takes for granted." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd, but Daniel didn't stop. "I don't care about your politics. I don't care about your rules. All I know is that I would rather fight for her than let you decide she's meant to be forgotten." Ariana's head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable, but through the bond, he felt the warmth of her amusement. He was breaking every rule, shattering centuries of protocol, and she wasn't stopping him. Because she didn't want to. For the first time in her life, someone was standing beside her, not out of duty, not out of obligation, but because they chose to. The Grand Arbiter studied him for a long moment before turning to Ariana. "And you, Princess?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Do you accept this bond?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word rang through the chamber like a strike against stone, undeniable and absolute. A declaration. A challenge. Daniel felt the shift in the court's atmosphere, the slow, reluctant realization that the world they had built could no longer remain unchanged. Ariana was no longer the forgotten heiress. No longer the princess hidden behind closed doors. She was something else now. Something dangerous. And Daniel? He had walked into the heart of an empire that had never intended to welcome him, and in doing so, he had rewritten the rules of a game they had thought was already decided. But even as the weight of their victory settled around them, he knew the fight was far from over. Because bonds were not just recognized. They were tested. The weight of the bond still lingered in Daniel's mind, an unshakable presence woven into his thoughts, his very being. He had never experienced anything like it, a connection that ran deeper than instinct, more profound than words. Ariana was a part of him now, and he of her. It should have been a victory, a moment of undeniable triumph. And yet, beneath the surface of the Lumian court's measured acceptance, something darker festered. It began with the whispers. Not all of the council had spoken their opposition openly, but Daniel had seen it in their eyes. The unease. The anger. The fear. A bond between a human and a Lumian princess was not just unprecedented, it was dangerous. To them, it was a disruption to the order they had carefully preserved for generations. And when order is threatened, those who stand to lose the most will do whatever it takes to restore it. Ariana felt it too. Through their bond, Daniel sensed the shift in her emotions, the quiet wariness, the uncertainty that she tried to hide. She was no stranger to the politics of the court, to the undercurrents of power that dictated the lives of those around her. But this was different. This was personal. Daniel didn't fully understand how deep the resentment ran until the first attempt on his life. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, a miscalculated dose of a supposedly routine supplement, one meant to help his body adjust to the Lumian atmosphere. If he hadn't been trained to recognize the signs of poisoning, he might have dismissed the sudden weakness in his limbs, the sluggishness clouding his mind. Someone had been careful, methodical, ensuring that suspicion would fall on no one in particular. But Daniel was not so easily broken. When he confronted the royal medics, their fear was genuine. None of them had administered the dose. Someone had tampered with it after the fact. The implications were clear, the threat was not coming from the shadows, from some nameless enemy lurking in the city's underbelly. It was coming from within the palace. Ariana was furious. Not just at the attempt on Daniel's life, but at the insult it carried, the notion that her bond could simply be severed by force, that she could be controlled by eliminating the one person who had ever truly stood beside her. "We cannot let this go unanswered," she said, her voice colder than he had ever heard it. "We won't," Daniel assured her. But as much as he wanted to hunt down the traitor himself, they had to be careful. This was no simple assassination attempt, it was a message. A warning. Someone within the court was willing to go to great lengths to see their bond undone. And if one attempt had failed, another would surely follow. They needed to draw their enemy into the open. Ariana devised the plan. A formal gathering, a celebration of the bond, a public display of its legitimacy. It would force their enemies to act, to reveal themselves. The court would have no choice but to acknowledge them, to show their true allegiances. Daniel played his part, standing at Ariana's side as the palace filled with nobles, warriors, and advisors. The air was thick with tension, masked beneath layers of polite smiles and carefully measured words. But he could feel it, that undercurrent of hostility, the silent resistance. And then, as the night drew on, it happened. Ariana suddenly stiffened beside him, her fingers tightening around his wrist. He felt it before he saw it, a flicker of danger threading through their bond, an instinctive warning. A servant moved toward them, a tray in hand, his steps too precise, too rehearsed. The moment the cup was offered, Daniel reacted. He grabbed Ariana, pulling her back just as the goblet shattered on the floor, its contents hissing against the marble like acid. Gasps filled the hall, the music halting in an instant. Guards rushed forward, seizing the servant, but Daniel's focus was already on the figure standing at the edge of the room. One of the elders. Not just any elder, Aurelius, a staunch traditionalist, one who had argued against Ariana's claim to the throne long before Daniel had arrived. His face remained impassive, but Daniel saw the calculation in his gaze, the momentary flicker of realization that his plan had failed. Ariana turned to face him, her voice steady, unwavering. "You dare to do this under my roof?" Aurelius did not deny it. Instead, he met her gaze with the calm certainty of a man who believed he was still in control. "Your Highness, I act only for the good of our people. This bond is an abomination. You know it as well as I do." Daniel clenched his fists, his anger barely restrained. "You call an attempt on her life the act of a patriot?" Aurelius's gaze flicked toward him, unreadable. "Not an attempt on her life, human. Only yours. The court will never accept an outsider as her bondmate." Ariana took a step forward, her presence commanding. "Then the court will learn to adapt." Aurelius's jaw tightened. "You are making a mistake." She did not flinch. "No. You did, the moment you underestimated me." With a single gesture, she signaled the guards. Aurelius was seized, his protests drowned out by the murmurs of the gathered court. Daniel exhaled, tension still thrumming through his body. This battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The hidden betrayal had been exposed, but it was only the beginning. Because if one elder had been willing to act against them, how many more were waiting in the shadows? Daniel had always known that truth was a fragile thing. It was never simply about facts, it was about perception, about control. Those who controlled the narrative controlled everything. And right now, the truth about the attempt on his life was being buried beneath layers of misdirection and silence. Aurelius had been arrested, but that was only the beginning. His followers had not disappeared. If anything, they had grown bolder, whispering behind closed doors, weaving new justifications for their actions. It was never just about him. It was about the bond. About Ariana. About the future they represented. A future that terrified them. "We need more than just a conviction," Ariana said, her voice low but urgent as they stood in the private chamber of her quarters. "If we leave this as an isolated betrayal, the council will sweep it away. We need to expose the entire conspiracy." Daniel met her gaze, his mind already turning. "Then we find the others. We make them show their hand." The problem was, their enemies were smart. The attempt on his life had been careful, deliberate. They had worked through intermediaries, expendable pawns who knew little of the real masterminds. Aurelius had been willing to take the fall, but he had not acted alone. Daniel wasn't a politician, but he knew how to track enemies. He knew how to chase ghosts. The first lead came in the form of a named Kaler, a high-ranking noble who had always been one step removed from Aurelius's inner circle. A supporter, but never publicly outspoken. He had wealth, influence, and most importantly, connections to the supply chains that could smuggle poisons and weapons through the palace unnoticed. So Daniel went hunting. Kaler's estate was a fortress of its own, a sprawling complex perched on the cliffs overlooking the Lumian capital. Getting inside wasn't the problem. Daniel had broken into far more secure locations during his time in special forces. The problem was getting out with the truth. Under the cover of night, he moved like a shadow through the halls, his every step measured. He had no intention of killing anyone tonight. Death was easy, clean. Truth required something far more dangerous: exposure. The evidence was hidden deep within Kaler's personal chambers, encrypted data files filled with transaction logs and communication records. But it wasn't the files that caught Daniel's attention first. It was the conversation happening just beyond the corridor. He pressed himself against the cold stone wall, straining to listen. Aurelius was reckless, Kaler's voice carried through the dimly lit hall. "But his failure doesn't mean the plan is finished." A second voice, unfamiliar. "The council is watching too closely now. That's why we shift our approach. The human cannot be eliminated, not yet. But if Ariana were to lose faith in him, if he were made to seem unworthy..." Daniel's pulse quickened. This was more than just resistance to their bond. This was something deeper, more insidious. They weren't just trying to kill him. They were trying to break them apart. The air turned electric with the weight of realization. It wasn't just about Ariana's position anymore. It was about what their bond represented, something beyond politics, beyond tradition. It was about fear. Fear of change. Fear of unity. Fear that the bond between them was not a mistake but an evolution. And they would do anything to stop it? Daniel exhaled slowly, centering himself. He had the confirmation he needed. Now he just had to get out. But the moment he turned, a blade met his throat. He hadn't heard them approach. That was rare. A Lumian warrior, clad in ceremonial armor, his stance rigid with discipline. "You should not be here, human," the guard said coldly. Daniel smiled grimly. "And yet, here I am." In a single fluid motion, he twisted, breaking the guard's grip and driving an elbow into his ribs. The warrior staggered, but recovered quickly, drawing a second blade. Daniel had no weapons. He didn't need them. He moved fast, using the confined space to his advantage. His training had been honed in war, against enemies stronger, faster, and more brutal than this. He dodged the strike, his hand snapping out to seize the guard's wrist. A sharp twist, and the blade clattered to the ground. A second later, Daniel struck one precise blow to the temple. The warrior collapsed. Daniel wasted no time. He retrieved the files and vanished into the night. Back in the safety of the palace, Ariana was waiting for him. The moment he stepped inside, she knew. She felt it through their bond, the weight of what he had uncovered. "You were right," he said, his voice quiet. "Aurelius wasn't working alone. And they're not done." Her expression hardened, but there was something else in her eyes, something deeper than anger. Determination. "We expose them," she said. "Every last one of them." For the first time, Daniel saw it clearly. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the future. And they were ready to fight. The war should never have happened. It was not born from necessity or survival but from fear, from the desperation of those who refused to accept change. It was a war waged not against an enemy but against the inevitable. And yet, here they stood on the precipice of destruction, with armies poised to kill for a cause that had no future. Daniel had seen wars before. He had fought in them, bled in them, lost men in them. But this was different. This was not about land or resources. This was about control, about who had the right to shape the future. And at the heart of it all was Ariana. Or rather, what she and Daniel represented. The bond between them was a crack in the foundation of Lumian tradition, a fracture that terrified those who had spent centuries preserving the old ways. Their child, growing within her, was proof that the future was already shifting. And instead of embracing it, the old guard had chosen war. The council had fractured. Some saw the truth, that this war was nothing more than a desperate grasp at power. Others, those still loyal to the conspirators, had rallied their forces under the banner of preserving Lumian purity. They spoke of Daniel as a corrupting force, a foreign invader who had stolen their princess and defiled their bloodline. It was absurd, a hollow excuse to justify their fear, but it was enough to turn words into weapons. The first attack came at dawn. A fleet of Lumian warships, their sleek crystalline forms cutting through the sky like celestial blades, descended upon the capital. The palace defenses held, but only just. Explosions rippled through the lower districts, sending civilians scattering in terror. This was not an assassination attempt. This was war. Daniel stood at Ariana's side as the command room erupted into chaos. Generals argued, council members demanded action, and throughout it all, Ariana remained still, her hands resting on the swell of her stomach, her mind calm in a way that only he could feel through their bond. "They want us to retaliate," she said softly. Daniel nodded, watching the holographic display of the battlefield. The enemy forces were positioning themselves for a prolonged siege, waiting for the ruling faction to lash out. "They need us to strike first," he said grimly. "So they can claim we're the aggressors." It was a classic tactic. He had seen it before in countless wars, where those in power manipulated perception to justify the unjustifiable. Ariana turned to him, her silver eyes sharp with understanding. "Then we don't play their game." It was not surrender. It was strategy. Instead of deploying the full force of their army, Ariana commanded surgical strikes, targeting supply lines, disabling weapons systems without unnecessary bloodshed. Daniel led covert operations, dismantling enemy command networks from within. They struck like ghosts, precise, unrelenting, never giving their enemies the open war they craved. But the enemy was ruthless. When they could not win on the battlefield, they turned to terror. Civilian districts were bombed, supply routes poisoned, captured soldiers executed publicly. They were trying to break them, to force Ariana's hand, to make her abandon diplomacy in favor of vengeance. Daniel could feel the weight of it pressing against her. He could feel it in himself. The anger, the frustration, the raw need to strike back and end it. Then came the final blow. Ariana's father, the king, had been a prisoner of the conspirators for months, held in silence while the war raged on. And then, without warning, they executed him. Publicly. The transmission was sent to every Lumian colony, to every world under their rule. The message was clear. The old ways were dead. The new order was rising. Daniel had seen Ariana endure cruelty before. He had seen her rejected, cast aside, underestimated. He had seen her stand against those who would see her as nothing more than a fragile heir unworthy of the throne. But this was the moment she broke. Not with grief. Not with rage. But with resolve. "We end this," she said, her voice quiet, but unshakable. Daniel met her gaze. "How?" "Not with destruction," she said. "With truth." The war had always been built on lies, on the fear-mongering of those who refused to accept change. But truth was a weapon far more powerful than any fleet. And Ariana had the means to wield it. She called for a final gathering, a summit where both sides were forced to face each other not as enemies on the battlefield, but as leaders with the fate of their people in their hands. And when they came, she revealed the truth. The conspirators had never been fighting for Lumian tradition. They had been fighting for their own power. The war was a sham, a tool to keep them in control. She laid bare the evidence: every secret meeting, every manipulated order, every false attack designed to push the narrative of war. And then she gave them a choice. Continue fighting and destroy themselves, or accept the future that had already arrived. It was not an easy victory. Some refused to listen. Some still clung to the old ways, to their hatred, to their fear. But enough of them saw the truth. Enough of them realized that the war should never have been. The fighting stopped. The conspirators were stripped of power. And for the first time in Lumian history, a human stood beside a Lumian ruler, not as a conqueror, not as a threat, but as an equal. Daniel took Ariana's hand, feeling the steady pulse of her presence through their bond. The war that should never have been was over. And the future had finally begun. The halls of the palace were silent in the early hours before dawn, but silence was never truly empty. It carried whispers of the past, echoes of battles fought and sacrifices made. Daniel Stonnell stood on the balcony overlooking the Lumian capital, watching as the first light of day crept across the crystalline spires. He had stood on countless battlefields, but none had ever felt as uncertain as this moment. Behind him, Ariana stirred. Though she could not see, she had long since learned to sense him, to feel his presence in ways that transcended sight. The bond between them had grown stronger with every hardship, and now, with the war over, it was the only certainty they had left. She moved toward him, her step slow but sure. The weight of her crown, the burden of leadership, pressed upon her, but she carried it with the same quiet strength she always had. Daniel turned as she approached, his gaze meeting hers. "You couldn't sleep either," she murmured. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Too much on my mind." The war was over. The conspirators had been exposed, the corruption rooted out. Ariana had reclaimed her throne not through conquest, but through truth. And yet, peace was fragile. Not everyone accepted their rule. Not everyone was ready for what came next. Neither was he. Daniel had never wanted to be a ruler. He had come to this world a soldier, an outsider. Even now, with Ariana at his side, he could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes watching him, judging him. He was tolerated, respected even, but never truly accepted. A human ruling beside a Lumian queen? It was unheard of. "I know what you're thinking," Ariana said softly. He glanced at her. "Do you?" She smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "You still believe you don't belong here?" He looked away. "Maybe I don't." Ariana reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "Daniel, you've fought for this world. For our people. You've given everything to protect them." She paused, searching for the right words. "But if this is not what you want, if staying here makes you feel like a prisoner, I won't ask you to." His grip tightened around hers. "You're not a prisoner, Ariana. You never were. Neither are you." The truth of it lay between them. He had fought for this world, but it was not his own. His home was among the stars, in the chaos of the unknown. The discipline of battle had shaped him, but he was no longer just a soldier. He was something more, something he had never expected to become. A father. His gaze drifted to Ariana's stomach, the faint glow of Lumian energy pulsing beneath her skin. Their child, something entirely new, something the universe had never seen before, was growing within her. He had fought wars, defied death, but the thought of being a father terrified him in ways he could not explain. Ariana followed his gaze, understanding the unspoken fear. "You're not alone in this," she whispered. "You never will be." The weight in his chest lessened, if only slightly. A knock at the door shattered the fragile quiet. One of Ariana's advisors stepped in, his expression grim. "Your Majesty. We have received word from the outer colonies. There is unrest." Daniel exchanged a glance with Ariana before turning back to the advisor. "Define unrest." "There are factions who still oppose the alliance. Some are calling for your removal. Others demand a return to traditional rule. There have been attacks." Ariana straightened, her expression unreadable. "On civilians." The advisor hesitated. "On those who have openly supported the new rule. And, on those who share human blood." Silence hung heavy in the air. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. Ariana's voice was ice. "Where?" "3 settlements on the outer rim. Reports indicate they were targeted specifically for harboring human traitors and those who defended your right to rule." Daniel swore under his breath. The war had ended, but the wounds it left had not yet healed. There were still those who saw him as a threat, who saw their child as an abomination rather than a bridge between worlds. Ariana turned to Daniel, and in that moment, he saw the decision already forming in her mind. She would not rule from behind palace walls. She never had. "I need to go," she said. Daniel shook his head. "It's too dangerous. If they're targeting humans and their allies, they'll be waiting for you." She lifted her chin. "That's exactly why I must go." She was right. If she did nothing, the violence would spread. But the thought of her walking into danger, of their child being put at risk, made his blood turn cold. "Then I'm going with you," he said. Ariana's expression softened. "I knew you'd say that." Within hours, they were on a transport ship, heading toward the colony that had suffered the worst of the attacks. The journey was tense, each moment spent preparing for the possibility of battle. When they arrived, what they saw was worse than expected. Homes burned, streets littered with debris. The people who had once thrived here now hid in fear. But it was not just Lumian extremists who had done this. Among the wreckage, Daniel found something that made his stomach drop. Weapons. Not Lumian weapons. Human-made. Ariana's breath caught as she realized what he had already understood. This wasn't just Lumian opposition, Daniel said, his voice grim. There are humans who want this alliance to fail just as much as some Lumians do. It was not a rebellion. It was something far worse. A war that should have ended had only shifted, changing form into something more insidious. Ariana turned to him, fire in her silver eyes. Then we expose them. The fight was not over. The enemies they had faced were only the beginning. The real battle was ahead. And together, they would face it. The ship drifted through the void, a lonely speck against the infinite expanse of space. Daniel Stonnell sat in the dim glow of the command console, watching as the distant light of an uncharted star bathed their vessel in soft gold. They were far from any known territory, beyond the reach of politics, war, or even allies. Exiled. It was a word that had once meant disgrace, a punishment for the defeated, for those who had failed. But as Daniel glanced back at the sleeping figure of Ariana, he knew that exile had taken on an entirely new meaning. It was not a punishment, it was a beginning. Ariana stirred, shifting beneath the silken blankets that did little to hide the faint glow of her Lumian energy. Her pregnancy had progressed faster than either of them had anticipated. It was as if their child, their impossible hybrid son, could sense the urgency of the universe itself. There was no more time for uncertainty. Daniel moved to her side, kneeling beside the bed as her silver eyes fluttered open. Even without sight, she could always find him. "You're awake," he murmured. Her lips curved into the softest of smiles. "So are you." He exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't think I've truly slept in months." Ariana reached out, her fingers grazing his cheek, tracing the lines of exhaustion that war and exile had carved into him. "Neither have I." They had left their world behind not by choice, but by necessity. The revelation of human involvement in the attacks had shattered what fragile peace they had built. Ariana's council had begged her to stay, to fight for her throne, to bring justice to those who had betrayed them. But the truth was bitter, her presence only deepened the divide. There were those who would never accept her child, who would see his existence as an affront to the natural order. And so, she had chosen exile. Not as a retreat, but as a chance to protect their future. Daniel had followed without hesitation. Now, adrift in the unknown, he wondered if they had made the right choice. He had always been a soldier, always fought to hold the line. Running felt unnatural. Ariana seemed to sense his thoughts. "You regret leaving?" He shook his head. "No, I regret that it had to be this way." She nodded, silent for a long moment. Then, she took his hand and pressed it against her stomach. Beneath his palm, he felt a shift faint, but undeniable. Life. Their child, growing stronger each day, untouched by war or politics. His throat tightened. "He's strong." Ariana's fingers curled over his. "Because he has to be." Daniel swallowed against the knot forming in his chest. He had spent his entire life fighting, but this was the most important battle of all. Keeping them safe, ensuring their son's future, finding a place where they could exist beyond exile. A sudden beeping from the ship's sensors broke the fragile quiet. Daniel stood, moving to the console. His heart clenched as he read the data. A ship was following them. Not Lumion. Not human. Unknown. Ariana sat up, instantly alert. What is it? Daniel's jaw tightened. We're not alone. He brought up the external feed, displaying the pursuing vessel. It was sleek, almost organic in design, unlike anything he had ever encountered. And it was closing fast. Ariana swung her legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the weight of her condition. Can we outrun them? Daniel assessed their options. They had been traveling through an uncharted system, taking advantage of its asteroid fields and gravitational anomalies to avoid detection. But whoever was following them had been careful, methodical. This wasn't an accident. They've been tracking us for a while, he said. I don't think running will help. Ariana's expression was calm, but her fingers curled slightly against the armrest of her chair. Then we find out what they want. He hesitated. Are you sure? She turned to face him, her silver eyes unyielding. We left our world to protect our child. If this is another threat, we end it here. Daniel clenched his fists, then exhaled. She was right. They couldn't afford to run forever. He opened a secure channel. Unknown vessel, this is Captain Daniel Stonnell of the... He hesitated, then smirked bitterly. Actually, we don't have a name for this ship yet. But I'd appreciate it if you told us why you're following us before we start shooting. Silence. Then, a voice crackled through the comms. Smooth, unfamiliar. Your reputation precedes you, Captain Stonnell. And yours, Princess Ariana. Daniel's grip on the controls tightened. Who are you? A brief pause. Then. We are the Violari. Daniel's blood ran cold. He had heard the name only in whispers, rumors passed between mercenaries and smugglers. A race older than both humanity and the Lumians, elusive, secretive. They did not interfere in wars. They did not make alliances. And yet, here they were. Ariana's fingers grazed Daniel's arm. Why are you here? She asked, voice steady. The reply came with quiet certainty. To offer you sanctuary. Silence filled the cockpit. Daniel exchanged a glance with Ariana. Why? The voice on the other end hesitated, then answered. Because your child is more important than you realize. And if you wish to protect him, you will come with us. Ariana's breath caught. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. This was not what they had expected. Ariana turned to him, something unreadable in her expression. Do we trust them? Daniel let out a slow breath. I don't know. But trust or not, one thing was certain, their journey was far from over. And their exile had only just begun.